Chapter 1. The Hatbox That Shouldn't Be Opened. The snow fell in fine silken threads over the Norfolk countryside, blurring the edges of hedgerows and covering the meadows in a virginal hush. At the center of this wintry landscape stood Charnwood Hall, a great Tudor Revival mansion of pale stone and brooding gables. Inside, the grand drawing-room was all warmth and opulence, crackling fire, velvet curtains, brass sconces, and the muted chatter of England's refined class nursing their sherries. Lady Eugenia Bracknell, hostess and widow of Lord Reginald Bracknell, had gathered an assortment of family and friends for what she termed a restorative weekend, the kind of affair that was equal parts genteel performance and subtle interrogation. Every eye noted every movement, every smile was a test, but none had expected the arrival of the Hatbox. It had come with the Morning Post, a large square box of black lacquered wood, without stamps or address. Hand-delivered by a driverless motor car that left no trace in the snowy gravel. Its hinges were sealed in crimson wax. No one knew from where it had come. Who ordered this monstrosity? Lady Eugenia had asked, her gloved hand hesitating over the lid. It is not on the inventory. No one claimed it. The guests gathered around it like mourners before a coffin, whispering theories. "That's not modern craftsmanship," muttered Colonel Willoughby. "Looks more like something from the Orient." "Perhaps a forgotten inheritance?" offered young Isla Bracknell, daughter of the house, with a theatrical shrug. "Or a threat," said Dr. Cresswell, narrowing his eyes. "Lady Bracknell, I advise it remain unopened until its origin is known." Lady Eugenia gave a dry laugh. "Are we to behave like frightened children? If this is a joke, it is a poor one." But still, she did not open it. That night, the snow grew heavier. The windows of Charnwood Hall glowed faintly through the drifts like eyes sunk in white flesh. Inside, dinner was served with the stiffness of obligation. Conversation faltered. The Hatbox had been placed in the study, behind lock and key. Even so, its presence unsettled the atmosphere. An unspoken wrongness hovered over the room, unsettling appetites and darkening glances. At precisely 10 o'clock, the power flickered, then failed. A hush fell. Somewhere upstairs, a clock stopped ticking. By the light of candles, guests were escorted to their rooms. Isla, ever theatrical, whispered to her cousin Jeremy, "It's like something out of a Gothic play, isn't it? I half expect someone to vanish before breakfast." She would be wrong. Someone vanished before dawn. At 4:37 a.m. the household was roused by the housemaid's scream. It came from the study. The door, which had been locked the night before, now stood ajar. Inside, books had been torn from the shelves. Papers had been scattered. The fireplace was still warm, but of the Hatbox there was no trace, nor, for that matter, of Jeremy Colefield. The young man's bed had not been slept in. His boots were missing from the wardrobe, yet his coat and scarf remained. The windows were locked from the inside. No footprints led away from the house. "Vanished," murmured Lady Eugenia, pale but composed. "That is not an acceptable word in this household." The local constable was summoned, but brought little insight. "There's no sign of forced entry. Nor exit," he concluded, scratching his ear with a pencil stub. "Strange business. Stranger still, I suppose, that you don't recognize the box. If it was delivered here, someone must have known your address." "He wouldn't have run off," Isla insisted. "Not Jeremy. He had no enemies, no debts. He was due to inherit from Uncle this year." The implication landed heavily in the room. Someone coughed. Dr. Cresswell cleared his throat. "Lady Bracknell, with all respect, this matter may call for a specialist, not just the police." She pursed her lips. "You're thinking of that little Belgian detective, aren't you?" "I know him," said Colonel Willoughby, suddenly interested. "Met him once in Cairo. Sharpest mind I've ever seen. Quiet fellow, dresses like a banker and thinks like a scalpel. If there's something to be solved, he'll see through it. A decision was made. That afternoon a telegram was dispatched to London. Urgent. Charnwood Hall. Unexplained disappearance. Object of concern, antique hatbox, requesting immediate aid, to Monsieur Hercule Poirot. And thus, though they did not yet know it, the guests of Charnwood Hall had set in motion a most singular affair, one that would not merely rattle the great house, but cut through its secrets like a scalpel through silk. Somewhere in the deep snow, the truth was hidden, and Poirot was already on his way. Chapter 2. The First Clues. The sky above Charnwood Hall remained the color of ash, pressing low and silent upon the frozen earth. Snow clung to the stone arches and the black iron gates, muting the world beyond the estate. Within, the house had fallen into a grim rhythm. Doors opened more cautiously, voices dropped in pitch, and even the staff moved with unnatural restraint. Jeremy Caulfield was still missing. By morning, the study had been cordoned off. Constable Liddle, red-faced and out of depth, stood at its threshold scribbling in a notebook. A soft drizzle of sleet pattered against the window panes, and the smell of damp leather and extinguished smoke lingered in the air. Lady Eugenia sat at the head of the drawing-room, stiff as the portrait above her. "I want no dramatics," she declared. "Jeremy is likely sulking in some folly or outhouse, seeking attention. He's always had a flair for the theatrical." "Then why take the Hatbox?" Isla Bracknell said, arms crossed. "Why tear the room apart like that? This wasn't a prank, Aunt. It was desperate." The others said nothing, though glances passed like ripples, glances that weighed and judged. Dr. Cresswell took a slow breath, eyeing the hallway as though expecting it to speak. The fire was warm when the maid entered. Someone had been in there recently. But who, and why? Colonel Willoughby stood by the window, arms behind his back. And why was the door unlocked? "I distinctly remember locking it myself last night after dinner." "You had the only key?" asked the constable. "Lady Eugenia gave it to me. I returned it to her bedroom door before I retired." Lady Eugenia gave a slow nod. "I placed it on my writing desk." "And yet the door was open," Isla whispered. Constable Liddle cleared his throat. "Let us proceed in order." They returned to the study. Light from the tall windows did little to soften the scene. A chair had been overturned. Ink had bled across a carpet, and 2 antique volumes lay with spines snapped beneath a cabinet. A poker leaned oddly beside the hearth, its end blackened and damp. "I've checked the windows," said Liddle. "Still latched from inside. Fireplace chute is too narrow for a man to escape through." "No footprints either," added Dr. Cresswell grimly. "I walked the perimeter this morning. No marks in the snow leading away from any entrance." "But the Hatbox?" Isla approached the desk, her hand hovering above a fine layer of soot. "It was here. I remember the way it reflected the firelight, black and gleaming. It felt wrong." "Wrong how, Miss Bracknell?" Liddle asked. "I don't know. Like it didn't belong in this century. Something ancient, something kept shut for a reason." Constable Liddle made a note. "You said no one here recognized it." "None of us," said Lady Eugenia firmly, "nor any of the staff. It was not ordered, and it bears no mark of sender." Colonel Willoughby moved closer to the hearth and pointed to the side wall. "There, scrape marks." Indeed, faint but visible, were curved scratches on the wooden floor, as if something heavy had been dragged, a trail leading from the desk to the fireplace and ending abruptly. The constable knelt. "These are fresh, still a few splinters about." "Then someone dragged the box, or something like it, across the floor," murmured Cresswell. "Toward the fire. But why?" "Jeremy would not have done this alone," Isla said suddenly. "He was brave in the daylight, but he couldn't even read ghost stories at night without getting nightmares. If he took the Hatbox, someone coerced him. or he was afraid of something. Lady Eugenia stood. "You are letting fancies distort reason." "No," Isla whispered. "You are pretending everything is normal because you fear what this means." There was silence for a long moment. Then Lady Eugenia's voice, cold and clear. "Constable, do your duty. The rest of us shall remain indoors. No one leaves until Jeremy is found." That afternoon, while the house fell into a tense quiet, Liddell and one of the footmen searched the estate grounds. They found no footprints that led away from the study, no signs of sleds, carts, or hidden vehicles. The driverless motor car, too, had left no tracks, its wheels somehow untouched by the slush. It was as if it had glided. Inside, the drawing room became an antechamber to suspicion. Colonel Willoughby smoked furiously. Isla stared into the fire. Cresswell read without turning a page. "Jeremy had been acting strangely," Isla said at last. "3 days ago, he said something that unsettled me." "What was it?" Cresswell asked without looking up. "He said, 'Some things shouldn't be opened, even if you're told to.' I thought he was joking. Now I wonder, did he know about the Hatbox before it arrived?" Willoughby gave a low grunt. "He was in London last week, and he returned with a new walking stick, not at all his usual taste." "Where is that stick now?" asked Dr. Cresswell. "Gone, apparently." "Gone, like him," Isla murmured. At that moment, the butler entered, carrying a small folded note. "Lady Eugenia," he said. "This was found tucked beneath the carpet in Mr. Caulfield's room." The note was written in shaky script. It read, "I heard the ticking again. It's louder now. I tried to burn it. It will not burn." Cresswell went pale. "Ticking. There's no clock in the study," Isla said. "No, but Jeremy used to say he heard one, even in silence." Lady Eugenia took the note with trembling fingers, then slowly folded it and placed it in her sleeve. "Enough nonsense," she said. "We are being drawn into some melodrama." "But Lady Bracknell," Isla said, "what if this isn't a drama? What if this is only the first act?" No one answered her. Outside, the snow began again, quiet, persistent, and indifferent. Somewhere far off, a train whistled across the blank moors. And somewhere else, miles away in London, a man in a waxed mustache, patent leather shoes, and a perfect bow tie sipped hot chocolate beside a morning newspaper. His eyes narrowed on a headline. "Man vanishes from locked study. Hatbox missing in Norfolk mystery." He tapped the article twice, folded the page precisely, and murmured in a soft Belgian accent, "Ah, this is most irregular." Chapter 3. The Gathering of Suspects. By the following morning, the frost had deepened into a crusted silence that blanketed every hedge, branch, and window pane of Charnwood Hall. Inside, the hush was more human, thicker, weighted with secrets. No one had slept well. Some, not at all. The house had become a warren of closed doors and whispered footsteps. Even the familiar scent of fresh bread in the dining room couldn't mask the uneasy glances traded over teacups. Lady Eugenia, dressed in black satin and her most formidable pearls, summoned the guests to the library just past 10 o'clock. A fire had been lit and breakfast laid out on the long oak table as though to disguise the purpose of the meeting with civility. But no one mistook it for hospitality. "My friends," she said, standing stiffly at the mantelpiece, "until the authorities are satisfied as to Jeremy's whereabouts, I ask that no one leaves the grounds. This is no longer a weekend retreat, it is an investigation." Her eyes moved deliberately across the room, over the assembled suspects. There was Isla Bracknell, slender, pale, her dark eyes rimmed in sleepless smudges. Lady Eugenia's niece and Jeremy's cousin, or more, depending on who one believed. Next to her sat Dr. Cresswell, tall, angular, with nicotine-stained fingers and the detached air of a man who had spent too long speaking only to the dying. In a nearby chair lounged Colonel Arthur Willoughby, retired from the Bengal Lancers, a man of habitual suspicion and barked commands. His loyalty to the Bracknell family was long-standing, but so were his unspoken grievances. Beside him stood Miss Lenora Gray, governess-turned-companion, now in her 30s, with severe brows and an unreadable calm. No one knew where she had come from before arriving at Charnwood 5 years ago. Fewer still knew why she had stayed. Lastly, near the bookshelf, trying very hard not to be noticed, was Mr. Felix Durand, a family acquaintance from Paris, invited by Jeremy, but as of yet offering little in the way of conversation. He was a man with excellent tailoring, perfect manners, and no past anyone could quite account for. Each of them had a reason to be there, and perhaps a reason to want Jeremy Caulfield not to be. "I trust," said Lady Eugenia, "that you all understand the gravity of this situation. Jeremy has not simply wandered off. The police suspect misadventure, or worse. Until we know the truth, I expect your cooperation." There was a rustle of discomfort. It was Dr. Cresswell who spoke first. "Are we to be questioned, then? Treated as suspects in some locked-room melodrama?" "We are not suspects," Isla snapped. "We're the only ones who could have done it." "That's what no one wants to say." Willoughby exhaled sharply. "That's enough, Isla." But her eyes did not move from Lady Eugenia's. Why was he in the study alone? Why was the door unlocked? Who moved the hatbox? And where is it now? Lady Eugenia turned her head slowly. "Those are questions for the authorities, not for accusations over breakfast." The room held its breath. Felix Durand finally spoke, his voice smooth, lightly accented. "Pardon, madame, but if we are confined here, might we at least understand one another? This box, was it locked when first received?" "Yes," said Lady Eugenia. "Sealed with wax. Red, circular, with no impression. Any writing?" "None. No address. No card. Simply delivered." Durand tilted his head. "Then it was meant not to be found, but to be opened. That is always the intention with things locked without explanation." Willoughby scoffed. "Sounding rather philosophical for a box, aren't we?" "I merely point out," Durand said mildly, "that such an object, sent anonymously into a house full of wealth, legacy, and complex affections. It is not merely an ornament, it is a message." Lenora Gray raised an eyebrow. "Do you suppose Jeremy deciphered that message?" "I think," said Isla, folding her arms, "Jeremy knew what it meant, and that's why he's gone." The room stiffened. Lady Eugenia looked down at the fire. Then the door opened quietly. The butler stepped inside. "Madam, a visitor has arrived." Lady Eugenia turned sharply. "Who?" "A gentleman from London. He says he is expected." The guests turned as one when the door opened again. There stood a small, neat man in an immaculate grey suit, mustache waxed to perfection, shoes that gleamed like glass, and an expression of supreme composure, his head inclined politely. "Pardon the intrusion," said Hercule Poirot, "but I believe I was summoned to inspect a box that does not wish to remain closed." Lady Eugenia blinked. "Monsieur Poirot, I presume." "Indeed, you are Lady Bracknell. And these," he gestured around, "are the companions to our little puzzle, n'est-ce pas?" No one spoke. Poirot moved further into the room. "You must forgive my rudeness, but I do not believe in wasting time. A young man is missing, and an object most peculiar has vanished with him. I should very much like to see the place from which it departed." Lady Eugenia nodded slowly. "Of course, the study is as we left it. Constable Liddell remains stationed outside." Poirot turned toward the door, then paused and looked back. "But first," he said softly, "I will take a single moment to look into each of your faces. One cannot solve a puzzle without first knowing the shape of the pieces." He let his gaze rest upon each of them, one by one. Cresswell's eyes narrowed beneath his spectacles. Willoughby's brow furrowed. Durand smiled faintly, as if in amusement. Lenora Gray stared back without blinking. Isla lowered her eyes. Lady Eugenia remained still as stone. Poirot smiled gently. "Yes, the shapes are quite distinct. We shall see how they fit together." And with that, he turned and walked, unhurried, toward the study. Behind him, silence once again took hold. But in its heart, the house had begun to stir. Chapter 4. Poirot arrives. The door to the study creaked as Poirot stepped inside, and for a long moment he did not move. He simply stood in the doorway, hands folded neatly before him, eyes roaming the space with quiet intensity. To most, the room would appear ordinary. Disordered, yes, but familiar in its domestic disarray. Books still littered the floor, the scent of extinguished ash hung faintly in the air, and the poker remained propped against the hearth like a forgotten weapon. But to Hercule Poirot, the room was shouting, not in chaos, but in pattern. He stepped forward on the balls of his feet, gaze flicking upward toward the crown molding, downward to the worn grooves in the carpet, then across to the tall windows where frost curled like veins along the glass. The constable stationed at the door stood to attention. "Sir, nothing's been moved," per Lady Bracknell's instruction. "Très bien," Poirot murmured. "You have done well." He walked slowly to the fireplace, where the grate still held traces of half-burned paper. Stooping carefully, he withdrew a delicate pair of silver tongs from his coat pocket and used them to lift a singed edge of parchment. The ink had bled away, but a few odd markings remained, lines in the shape of an arc, like the top of a circle. He said nothing. "Could that be part of a letter?" the constable asked. Poirot straightened. A letter, perhaps. Or not. One must not decide before the facts are complete. That is how the truth is lost, mon ami. He turned now toward the desk. The top had been wiped in places, as though someone had run a trembling hand across its surface. Poirot noted the drawers, some ajar, some not. He opened each slowly. In one, an empty envelope. In another, the shattered head of a fountain pen. In the third, he stopped. Within the narrow space sat a small feather, blue-black, glossy, no longer than a quill tip. He plucked it gently with the tongs, holding it to the light. "Not from a bird of this region," he murmured. "Too fine, too tropical." He pocketed it. At that moment, the door creaked again, and Isla Bracknell entered, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "I wondered if you might be here," she said. "I thought you'd want to see the room before anything else." "Ah, Mademoiselle Bracknell," said Poirot, turning with a slight bow. "Your instincts serve you well." She offered a wan smile. "I don't know if I trust my instincts anymore. Everything feels wrong." Poirot gestured toward the room. "Tell me, if you please, what was the exact arrangement when the Hatbox was last seen?" She stepped forward cautiously. "It was there, on the desk, closed. I remember it so clearly. The firelight hid it in such a way that it almost shimmered. Jeremy was fascinated by it. He said it gave him a feeling, though he couldn't describe it." "Did anyone touch it?" "Not then, but I saw Dr. Cresswell lean in close. He seemed disturbed. Or intrigued." Poirot noted this. "And you, mademoiselle, did you open it?" "No." Her voice rose sharply, then softened. "No, I was afraid of it. We all were, though no one would admit it." Poirot stepped closer to the hearth. "Tell me, what did Jeremy Caulfield fear?" She was silent for a long moment. Then, "Being forgotten. He was theatrical, yes, but it came from a place of dread. He wanted people to remember him, not for wealth or lineage, but for what he did." "Ambition, then?" "In a way." He spoke of legacies, of stories. He was obsessed with the idea that some stories repeat themselves, and that others consume. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Consume? She bit her lip. He said something strange the day before he disappeared. He was in the library, reading a book about ancient rituals. He said, "We don't inherit just names and houses. We inherit silence. And sometimes silence wants to be broken." Poirot was quiet for a moment. Then he turned his full attention on her. "Mademoiselle, forgive me, but do you know what was inside the hatbox?" Her eyes widened. "No, no one opened it." He studied her face for several seconds longer before giving a polite nod. "Thank you, Mademoiselle Bracknell. You are most helpful." She lingered, unsure. "Then, you believe something else was here, don't you? Something not accounted for?" "I believe," Poirot said gently, "that something is always present in a room, even when it is missing." Back in the drawing room, the other guests waited with varying degrees of feigned indifference. Dr. Cresswell stood near the window, eyes narrowed as he watched the falling snow. Colonel Willoughby tapped the rim of his glass with a thumbnail, a low rhythm of nerves. Lenora Gray sat perfectly still in an armchair, hands folded in her lap, gaze unreadable. Félix Durand sketched idly in a small notebook, his pen looping elegant lines across the page. Poirot re-entered with the poise of a man entering a theatre, but his expression was unreadably mild. "I thank you for your patience," he said, glancing around the room. "The study confirms what I suspected." "And what is that, Monsieur Poirot?" asked Willoughby, almost challengingly. "That we are not dealing with a crime of impulse, but of intention. The scene has been carefully constructed, not merely to confuse, but to suggest something theatrical, deliberate. There is a performance happening here." Cresswell gave a dry laugh. "You think someone staged the disappearance?" "I think someone staged the room. As for the disappearance, I do not yet know if it is real." That sent a ripple through the group. "Do you mean Jeremy may have left of his own accord?" Lenora asked, one brow raised. "Possibly," Poirot said, "or he was made to believe that he must. Either way, there is deception, and where there is deception, there is design." Durand set down his sketchbook. "And the hatbox?" Poirot smiled faintly. "It is the symbol at the center of our riddle, a box that cannot be traced, delivered in silence, disappeared in silence. We must ask not merely what was inside the box, but what the box meant." Lady Eugenia stood. "This is all rather poetic, Monsieur Poirot, but I would appreciate something concrete, actionable." He turned to her with a slight bow. "Very well, madame. Then let us begin. I shall require a list of every item removed from Jeremy Caulfield's luggage, every page of correspondence, every person he spoke to in the last week." "And after that?" Lady Eugenia asked. Poirot's moustache twitched. "After that," he said, "we will allow the past to speak." And somewhere, behind the distant ticking of the Bracknell clocks, the house held its breath. Chapter 5. Initial Interviews. Begin. Hercule Poirot had a preference for quiet rooms, unadorned chairs, and subjects seated directly across from him with nothing to hide behind. Not tables, not bookshelves, not cups of tea. He was not a man who pried with volume, but with symmetry, the precise arrangement of words, posture, tone. Every interview was a carefully measured ritual, a pressure applied not to extract, but to reveal. The drawing room at Charnwood Hall was far too grand for his liking, so he selected the conservatory. It was glass-walled and frost-veiled, filled with winter-stiffened palms and quiet echoes. There, he placed 2 chairs, facing each other, equidistant, and began. The first to arrive was Dr. Bull, Cresswell. He entered with a cigarette already smouldering between his fingers, despite the posted signs prohibiting it. He lowered himself into the chair with a sigh that tried and failed to sound indifferent. "I assume you'd like me to recount where I was when Jeremy vanished," he said. "You'll find that I was precisely where I claimed, reading in my room with scotch and no alibi. How dreadfully convenient, eh?" Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, but the truth is not in the alibi, Doctor. It is in the details. You were in your room. But did you hear anything? Smell anything? Did something strike you as out of rhythm?" Cresswell tapped ash into a silver dish. "A sound, perhaps, just past midnight. A low, dragging scrape. But I assumed it was the house settling. Charnwood is always creaking like an old man's bones." Poirot nodded. "And your relationship with Mr. Caulfield?" Cresswell shrugged. "We weren't close. He was a boy playing at ideas, caught between genius and delusion. Always quoting obscure philosophers, inventing mysteries out of ordinary days. Charming enough. But he had a look about him sometimes, as if he expected something monstrous to happen, and wanted to be at the center of it when it did." Poirot folded his hands. "Did he speak of the Hatbox to you?" Cresswell looked up sharply, then exhaled. "He did. He said it was coming, that it had been promised." "Promised? By whom?" Cresswell crushed out the cigarette. "He never said." Poirot paused, then said softly, "Thank you, Doctor. That will be all for now." Next came Miss Lenora Gray, silent as snowfall. She walked into the conservatory without greeting and sat with a back as straight as marble. "You were Jeremy's tutor once," Poirot began, "when he was a boy." "Yes," she replied. "I arrived when he was 12. He was too clever for governesses, too unstructured for school. I taught him literature, Latin, mathematics, and how to be alone." Poirot tilted his head. An unusual skill to teach. He had no siblings. The house was full of silence. I taught him how to listen to it. "And what did he hear?" Lenora's eyes moved to the frost-laced glass. "Things that made him curious. Things that made others uneasy." "You speak as though he was hunted." She turned slowly back to Poirot. "Not hunted, but marked. Jeremy saw connections where others didn't. Threads between people, unspoken debts, family stories we're told to ignore. He wasn't afraid of the Hatbox, Monsieur Poirot. He was waiting for it. Why? Because he believed it held something that belonged to him." Poirot did not blink. "What kind of something?" "A truth," she said. "Or perhaps a name." Colonel Willoughby arrived with the stiffness of parade ground routine. He sat with his legs square and hands on knees, as if facing court-martial rather than conversation. "I had no quarrel with the boy," he stated. "Spoiled, yes, but that's modern children for you. All drama, no discipline." "And yet," Poirot said, "you once threatened to strike him during a dinner party 2 years ago." Willoughby's jaw tightened. He implied I was hiding something. Accused me, in front of Lady Eugenia, of knowing more about Lord Bracknell's death than I had let on. Poirot tilted his head. "And were you?" A pause. "No. Reginald died as men do, slowly and full of denial." "And what did you think of the box?" Willoughby frowned. "I didn't like it. Felt like a trick. It arrived too clean, too quiet. No seal, no handwriting. I've seen explosives packed in prettier containers." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "So you feared it?" Willoughby didn't answer. Felix Durand entered next, eyes bright and fingers fidgeting with a silver lighter. He sat lightly, as if the chair belonged to someone else and he was borrowing it for only a moment. "I imagine I'm your most suspicious guest," he said smoothly. "A foreigner, recently arrived, invited by the vanished man himself. It doesn't bode well for poor Felix, no." Poirot said nothing, only nodded for him to continue. Durand exhaled. Jeremy and I met in Paris last summer, a book auction of all places. He was bidding on a leather-bound volume of medieval cartography. I outbid him, but he cornered me later and demanded I sell it to him for twice the price. And did you? No, Durand said with a faint smile. But I liked his audacity. We talked over wine, swapped theories, discussed obscure manuscripts. He spoke of Charnwood often, said it was more than a house. He called it a palimpsest, layers of old truths beneath each room. And the Hatbox? Durand's smile faded. He said it would come from nowhere, and when it did, it would be his turn. I assumed it was metaphor. Poirot was quiet for a moment. And you, Monsieur Durand, do you believe Jeremy is still alive? Durand's gaze darkened. I believe he wants to be found, which is not the same thing. At last came Isla Bracknell, pale and restless. I've told you what I can, she said. I loved him, Monsieur Poirot. I don't know if that helps you or makes me a suspect. Perhaps both, Poirot replied gently. Tell me, what did you see in him that others did not? He wanted to see the world differently, but he didn't lie about it. He invited you to see it with him. Most people hated that. And you? I followed him, even when I didn't understand. Poirot folded his hands. Did he speak of danger? She hesitated. Not exactly, but he said that some truths were like songs. You only hear them when the silence is deep enough, and once you hear them, you can't go back. Poirot stood. Thank you, Mademoiselle Bracknell. You have given me much to consider. She rose. What happens now? Now, Poirot said, we listen for what the silence is trying to tell us. As Isla left, Poirot remained seated for a moment longer. Then he opened his notebook and wrote a single word beneath the names of each suspect. Contradiction. One of them was lying. But more intriguingly, one of them believed they were telling the truth. And that, Poirot knew, was always the most dangerous kind of deception. Chapter 6. The first false lead. That evening, the light at Charnwood Hall dimmed long before sunset. Heavy clouds smothered the windows in a dull grey, and the snow, relentless and silent, built upon the sills like an advancing siege. Within the house, Poirot requested that the guests be confined to their rooms for an hour, not for suspicion, but for clarity. Sometimes, he had said, the truth requires solitude to be seen clearly. He sat alone in the drawing-room with the butler, Mr. Hargrove, standing silently at a distance. On the table before Poirot lay several objects retrieved that day, the singed fragment of paper, the tropical feather, the burned pen nib, and the note found in Jeremy's room. I heard the ticking again. It's louder now. I tried to burn it. It will not burn. Poirot tapped a fingertip to the corner of the note. It is curious, he said aloud, that a man would speak of burning what will not burn, and yet there is a fire involved, no? Mr. Hargrove said nothing. Poirot looked up. You have served this house long? 30 years, sir. Then you have seen young Master Caulfield grow? I have. And how did he grow in your eyes? Hargrove hesitated, then said, curious, hungry for something. A boy who read too deeply and trusted too quickly. He would stare at the family portraits for hours, as if he expected one to blink. Poirot nodded slowly. Did he ever mention being afraid? Yes, sir, but never of people. Only of silence. There was a knock at the door. Constable Liddell entered, cap in hand and face ruddy from the cold. Monsieur Poirot, he said, we found something. In the East Wing attic. Poirot rose immediately. Ah, the attic. Always the place where forgotten things remember themselves. The attic was accessed by a narrow servant stair that spiraled up past unused linen closets and forgotten guest rooms. It smelled of old cedar, dust, and something faintly medicinal. When the door opened, the cold struck immediately. Poirot followed Liddell into the dim space where a single electric lamp had been suspended by cord. Beneath its light stood two housemaids and one of the younger footmen, all visibly shaken. At their feet lay a heavy crate, half buried beneath a moth-eaten drape. "I'll show you," said Liddell, lifting the cloth. It wasn't the Hatbox, but it was close. It was a second box, similar in shape and size, also lacquered, but without the ornate polish. This one was old, cracked in places, and bore a faded seal on the top, a stylized sunburst enclosed in an Ouroboros. Poirot's brow furrowed. "It was tucked behind a stack of old portraits," Liddell said. "Looked like it hadn't been touched in decades." Poirot knelt beside it. "Have you opened it?" "No, sir." Poirot examined the corners. No wax, no hinges, just a sliding panel with a thumb groove. He slid it open. Inside lay straw cushioning, yellowed and brittle. Resting at its center was a velvet pouch, and beneath it a ledger wrapped in parchment. Poirot removed both gently. He opened the pouch first. From it fell a small brass key and an oval locket, tarnished but ornate. He held it to the light and opened it. Inside were two portraits, painted miniatures. A woman in dark mourning dress with unreadable eyes. A man with high cheekbones and the faintest trace of a smile. Neither was labeled. Poirot turned to the ledger. The ink had faded to rust, but the first page was still legible. Property of R.B., inventory of kept objects. A list followed, jewelry, books, sealed envelopes. Correspondence marked not to be read before death. Poirot closed the book. "It is not the same box," he said at last, "but it is part of the same story." Liddell leaned in. "You think the missing Hatbox is connected to this?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "I do not believe in coincidences of this magnitude, Constable. Two Hatboxes, each secreted in silence, one appearing, the other forgotten. They are like twins, one from the past, one from the present." He turned the locket again. The woman's eyes seemed to follow. "Who is she?" Liddell asked. Poirot tapped the frame. "Someone who was meant to be remembered, and wasn't." He stood, gently cradling the objects. "Tell no one of this find." "Not yet." Later that night, at Poirot's request, the household assembled in the drawing-room once more. The fire crackled low, and no one sat. They remained standing like guests at a wake. Poirot addressed them quietly. "We have found another box," he said. "It is not the one that disappeared, but it belonged to Lord Reginald Bracknell. It contains a ledger of hidden objects and a locket with two faces unknown." Lady Eugenia's expression changed, just barely. Her fingers twitched at her side. "Does this box mean anything to you, madame?" "No," she said. Poirot looked to the others. "Nor to any of you." Willoughby shook his head. Cresswell frowned. Lenora, as always, said nothing. But it was Felix Durand who stepped forward. His brow furrowed in fascination. "That sunburst symbol," he said. "I've seen it before. In the book Jeremy was reading at the library before he vanished." "What book?" Isla asked sharply. "He wouldn't show me the cover," Durand said, "but I glimpsed a page, filled with esoteric diagrams, circles within circles. He said the book had no title, only weight." Poirot's voice was soft now. "Then we must find that book." Lady Eugenia cleared her throat. "That is impossible. His belongings were taken to the guest wing, and we have searched them thoroughly." Poirot did not look at her. "Nevertheless, madame, I shall search them again." "Myself." As the guests began to disperse, Poirot turned quietly to Isla and said, "Would you remain a moment, mademoiselle?" She did. He waited until the room had emptied before speaking again. "The faces in the locket," he said gently, "do not match any known portraits in this house. But I suspect you may recognize one of them. She said nothing for a long moment. Then, in a voice as brittle as snow underfoot, "That's Jeremy's grandmother, on his mother's side. She died before he was born. And the man? I don't know. He once said his family had unrecorded branches. People erased from the family tree." Poirot nodded slowly. "And perhaps one of those branches is bearing strange fruit now." Illa looked up sharply. "You think someone is punishing us for forgetting?" Poirot's voice was soft and certain. "No, mademoiselle. I believe someone is forcing the family to remember." And behind them, in the fire's low hiss, the silence nearly ticked. Chapter 7. The Psychological Game. The next morning, Charnwood Hall awoke to a thin, pale sun struggling through grey cloud, but no one remarked on the weather. It was as if the house itself had fallen beneath an invisible dome, sealed by secrets, tethered by silence. The snow had not stopped falling, but what unnerved the guests most was that the clocks had, every timepiece in the main house, grandfather, mantel, even the small one on Lady Eugenia's desk, had stopped overnight, each one frozen at a different hour, not one matching the others. Poirot, of course, was already awake. He walked the halls with gloves clasped behind his back, greeting the servants by name, pausing at portraits, stopping at windows not to admire the view but to calculate reflections. Nothing in his movement appeared hurried, but no step was wasted. He was studying the rhythm of the house and where it no longer held. He requested a quiet breakfast with Colonel Willoughby, who, after grumbling about civilian ritual, agreed with visible suspicion. They dined alone in the smoking room, eggs, toast, and strong tea. "Monsieur Poirot," Willoughby began, "I respect what you do, but I am not a man who thrives on riddles. If you have a theory, say it plainly." Poirot buttered his toast with delicate precision. "I do not yet have a theory, mon colonel. Only questions that narrow like a funnel. You are a man of order, yes?" "I was a soldier. Order is survival." "Then allow me to ask, what happens when order is interrupted?" Willoughby sipped his tea. "First, confusion. Second, questions. Third, control must be restored." "Ah," Poirot said, "but what if the disruption is not sudden, but subtle? A quiet undermining of structure. A whisper that disorients but does not alarm." Willoughby frowned. "You're suggesting manipulation." Poirot nodded. "Exactly. I believe someone here is performing a careful dissection of the household's nerves. The box, the disappearance, the clocks. These are not acts of madness. They are acts of control." Willoughby's face darkened. "Are you accusing someone of orchestrating Jeremy's disappearance as some kind of psychological warfare?" "I am not accusing. I am listening." He leaned in, tone low and precise. "And I believe someone here is lying, not by invention, but by omission. There is a person in this house who fears not guilt but exposure." Willoughby set down his cup. "Do you think it's me?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. "No, mon colonel, you are far too impatient to carry out so delicate a performance. You would shoot your villain before the curtain rose." Later that morning, Poirot conducted a more calculated conversation with Miss Lenora Gray. He met her in the music room, where she was polishing the brass candlesticks despite having no responsibility to do so. Her hands moved in neat circles, her gaze fixed forward. "You do not like idle time, mademoiselle," Poirot observed. "Idle time invites thought," she replied. "Thought invites memory. And memory is unwelcome. For some." Poirot did not sit. He circled slowly, as if the room were a chessboard and she a queen cornered by silence. "You taught Jeremy to think, to question. You gave him books most would not. I taught him to defend his mind against this house." "A strong claim," Poirot said. Lenora finally turned to him. "You think I'm manipulating people?" I think, Poirot said gently, that you know precisely which threads run deepest and which, if pulled, unravel the whole. She didn't deny it. Jeremy believed this family had tried to forget something. That an entire branch of the Bracknell legacy was buried, both literally and socially. And you encouraged this belief? No, I warned him that there is a cost to truth. Poirot stepped closer. And what, mademoiselle, do you fear will happen if that cost is paid? She said nothing, then very softly, that it won't change anything. That afternoon, Poirot requested a walk with Félix Durand, claiming the air was good for digestion. They circled the garden path, barely visible under the snow, while Poirot spoke lightly of botany, old French poetry, and the medicinal uses of hawthorn. Only when they reached the frozen fountain did Poirot stop and change the subject. You are an art dealer, are you not? Durand blinked. Books, mainly. Rare ones. Forbidden ones. Ones that contain things people would rather not be reminded of. Durand gave a cautious smile. I sell what people will pay for. Then you are familiar with the concept of symbolic intrusion. A term from psychoanalysis, Durand offered. Indeed. A symbol appears in a stable environment, an object that does not belong. Its presence disturbs the surface, calm. It demands reckoning. Like a hatbox, Durand murmured. Precisely. It did not belong here. And yet it arrived, unbidden. And when it did, Jeremy vanished. But not before speaking to you, I believe, about his turn. Durand's gaze didn't waver. He believed he was chosen for something. Chosen by whom? Durand hesitated. By the house, or by something in it? Poirot's voice dropped to a near whisper. And did you believe him? Durand smiled sadly. I think he wanted to be chosen, and I think someone gave him exactly what he wanted. Poirot paused. That is the most dangerous manipulation of all, he said. To convince a man that he is special, so that he walks into the trap willingly. Durand said nothing more. Back inside, Poirot joined Lady Eugenia in her private salon. She had not requested his presence, but nor did she object when he appeared. She sat near the fire, reading a slim book of aphorisms, one hand pressed against her temple. I will not have this household collapse into a theatre, she said as he entered. I fear, madame, Poirot said softly, that the stage has long since been set. You are merely being asked to acknowledge the performance. Lady Eugenia looked up. I have lived long enough to know that some ghosts should remain buried, even when they leave messages in ledgers. She flinched, barely. Poirot moved closer. What did Lord Bracknell hide in the attic, madame? Her fingers curled. He kept correspondence, affairs, secrets. All men of power do. It is part of their game. And you? I burned what I could. But some ashes resist the flame. Poirot studied her in silence. Then he bowed. Merci, madame. You have said enough. That evening, Poirot returned to his own room and removed the locket once more. He stared at the miniature portrait of the unnamed man. There was something in the eyes, something almost familiar now, a softness hidden beneath formality, a man who smiled at secrets. Poirot placed it beside his notes, where one word had been circled 3 times. Invitation. Because that, he realized, was what the Hatbox had been. Not a weapon, not a trap, an invitation, and someone in this house had accepted it. Chapter 8. A secondary mystery. The following morning began with the sound of raised voices in the corridor outside Poirot's guest chamber, unusual in a household otherwise governed by discretion and dread. Poirot, already fully dressed and seated at his writing desk, glanced up only briefly before setting down his pen. Moments later, a frantic knock came at his door. It was Isla Bracknell, breathless and pale, her hair undone, slippers half on. "It's Miss Grey," she said. "She's collapsed in the library." Poirot stood at once. Within 5 minutes, the entire household had gathered just outside the library's French doors. Lenora Gray sat upright in an armchair near the hearth, her face ghost white, eyes glazed with something that looked like shame or fear. Dr. Cresswell knelt beside her, wrist in hand, checking her pulse. "She'll live," he said tightly. But someone administered something, a sedative or worse. Poirot entered without asking. On the small tea table beside Lenora's chair stood a porcelain cup and saucer, still warm, faintly scented. Poirot sniffed it, chamomile, but with a subtle sharpness beneath. He turned to the butler, Hargrove. "Who brought the tea?" "No one, sir, not from the kitchens. We were not told to prepare any." "Then it was not prepared downstairs." Poirot lifted the cup, turned it gently, and noted a faint smudge on the rim. Lipstick, a color Lenora never wore. "Mademoiselle Gray," he said, kneeling before her now. "You are safe. But I must ask, did you pour this tea yourself?" Her lips moved slowly. "No." "Who did?" She hesitated. "I don't know. It was already there when I came in. I assumed it was from the staff." Poirot's voice dropped. "Was anyone else here when you arrived?" She shook her head. "I was early. I wanted time alone." Poirot turned to Cresswell. "What symptoms?" "Fatigue, dizziness, confusion. She'll sleep soon." Poirot nodded. "See that she's not left unattended, and send for me if she speaks anything more." As Lenora was helped gently from the room, Poirot remained behind. He turned slowly in the center of the library, his eyes scanning shelves, curtains, carpets, ceiling. Nothing appeared out of place. But then again, he was no longer expecting disorder. He was expecting order turned against itself. He crossed to the desk, tucked into the bay window, where a stack of books had been rearranged. The top volume was one of Byron's lesser-known works. Beneath it, The House of Hidden Inheritance by Montague Seur. Poirot flipped through it slowly. Page 113 had its corner turned down. A passage underlined in pencil read, "Those who inherit silence do not always survive it. The weight of what is unsaid must be carried, or it breaks the spine of the soul." He closed the book. This was not Jeremy's doing. He had vanished. This was someone else. A second act by an unseen player. By midday, Lady Eugenia summoned Poirot to her private parlor. Her composure had begun to fracture at the edges, and her tightly drawn face now carried shadows beneath the eyes. "Are we to have poisonings now, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked, pouring sherry with trembling fingers. "Must this house fall completely into melodrama?" "This was no dramatics, madame," Poirot replied calmly. "This was escalation." She eyed him coldly. "You believe someone attempted to harm Miss Grey?" "No," Poirot said. "I believe someone tried to silence her, or frighten her into silence." Lady Eugenia sipped. "She said nothing of use." "That," Poirot said gently, "is precisely what concerns me." A pause. Then he added, "And she was not the only one keeping secrets." He placed the small locket, retrieved again from his pocket, on the table beside the sherry. Lady Eugenia looked down at it. "She recognized it," Poirot said. "So did Ila, but you, madame, pretended not to." Lady Eugenia's jaw clenched. "There are things in this family we agreed not to speak of." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "Agreed? Or enforced?" She turned away, hand trembling slightly as she set her glass down. "There were children. Before me. Bastards, if you like the word. Illegitimate lines. Shut out of inheritance. Bracknels by blood but not by name. Reginald erased them. Locked away their records. I did not fight it. It was not my place." "But you knew," Poirot said. "I knew. And now," he asked. "Do you think one has returned?" Lady Eugenia's eyes flashed. "No, the dead stay dead, but someone wants us to believe otherwise. To punish. To haunt." Poirot said nothing, but inwardly, something settled. A second mystery had emerged. Not just who had sent the Hatbox, but why now? Why reopen a chapter buried in attic dust? Someone in this house was not who they claimed to be. And someone else had begun to suspect the truth. Later that afternoon, Poirot called a private meeting with Isla in the conservatory. Her hands were stuffed in her coat pockets, her shoulders tense. "Miss Grey trusted Jeremy," she said. "She might have told him more than she told anyone." "You believe she was protecting him?" Poirot asked. "I think she was protecting his obsession, this idea he had, that the Bracknells had rewritten their history. That someone had been removed from the family tree, and that now they were being written back in." Poirot considered this. And what did Jeremy intend to do? He wanted to find proof. He said that if you name the thing no one speaks of, it can't hurt you anymore. Poirot looked away for a moment, thoughtful. It is not always so simple. Sometimes naming a thing gives it life. A pause. "Did he find it?" Isla asked. Poirot turned to her. "I do not yet know, but I believe someone else did. And that person has now taken steps to keep it hidden." She drew a slow breath. "You think Jeremy's disappearance and Lenora's poisoning are both cover-ups?" Poirot shook his head. "No, mademoiselle. I think they are warnings." He stood. "And there will be another. Soon." That night, Poirot returned once more to Jeremy's guest room. He moved slowly, listening, not just with his ears, but with his memory. What had changed? What had remained? In the corner near the wardrobe, beneath the lowest drawer, he found it, a loose floorboard. He pried it gently. Inside, a small journal, bound in green leather, pages nearly full. The first page read, in Jeremy's hand, "To the one who finds this, thank you. I was not wrong. The house remembers." Poirot closed the book, and outside, beyond the windows, the frost deepened. The Hatbox had been only the beginning. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. The fire in Poirot's room had burned low by the time he finished reading Jeremy Caulfield's journal. Outside, the grounds of Charnwood Hall lay silent under a moonless sky, the snow a dimly glowing shroud that turned trees into ghosts and shadows into questions. Inside, Poirot's fingers turned each page of the worn green leather volume with practiced care, though his eyes had long since narrowed into the kind of concentrated stillness that signaled revelation. Not yet a solution, but proximity to one. Jeremy's entries were not always linear. They moved between past and present, memory and speculation, prose and poetry. But the pattern was there. "I know there was another Bracknell," Jeremy had written, "but no one says the name. It was spoken once, by Lenora when she thought I was asleep. She called him the one who signed in silence." Other entries were stranger. "The clocks stop when I get too close. I don't think it's metaphor anymore. And the box will arrive when the house is ready, or when I am." Poirot closed the journal slowly, then rang for Hargrove. "Bring Miss Isla Bracknell to the study," he said. "Quietly, and no one else is to know." 20 minutes later, Isla stood by the hearth, arms wrapped tight around herself, as Poirot sat at the desk with Jeremy's journal between them. "I need you to tell me what you and Jeremy discovered together," he said gently. She hesitated. Then, "We weren't just chasing family secrets. We were trying to prove there had been a deliberate erasure. Someone removed, cut out from the Bracknell records. Jeremy believed this missing person was still haunting the house in a way. Not a ghost? No, she whispered. A legacy. Jeremy believed the Hatbox came from whoever was written out." Poirot studied her. "And you believe it too?" She said nothing. Poirot opened the journal to a page marked with a ribbon. On it, Jeremy had drawn a tree. A family tree, but pruned. Several branches had been crudely crossed out. "Do you recognize the handwriting?" Poirot asked. Isla nodded. He made that the day after visiting the chapel crypt. Poirot blinked. "The family crypt?" "Yes. There's a small door behind the pulpit. Most don't know it's even there." He said he found something unusual. A plaque that had been scrubbed clean, and beside it, a stone with no inscription but covered in candle wax. Like someone had been visiting it in secret. Poirot's expression remained unreadable. "He told you this?" "Only me." "Did he take anything from the crypt?" "I think he took a rubbing of the stone, but I never saw it." Poirot closed the journal. "Then that is our next destination." The chapel at Charnwood Hall was small and ancient, older than the house itself, with Norman stonework and a roof so low Poirot had to duck beneath the arch. Inside, it smelled of lichen and dust, and the cold bit deeper than the air outside. Poirot found the hidden door easily enough. Behind the pulpit, half concealed by an old velvet curtain, was a narrow wooden panel that opened inward with a groan. Steps descended into shadow. He lit a lantern and went alone. The crypt was modest, its air dense with the scent of mildew and rust. Stone coffins lined the walls, some with names carved into them: Reginald Bracknell, Beatrice Bracknell, Thomas Bracknell. But one slab was different. No name, no date, only smooth stone and wax drippings along the base. Poirot knelt. In the dim light, he saw faint scratches, lines worn by time but still present. Someone had once inscribed this stone. Someone else had tried to erase it. He ran his fingers gently across the surface. A faint curve, the suggestion of a B. And then, beneath the wax, two letters still intact: R.E. Not Reginald, not Beatrice, but someone buried here who shared the family name. Someone intentionally hidden. Back in the main house, Poirot requested the old estate records, those not stored in the family library, but kept in the storage cellar near the east wing. Hargrove returned with them, bundled ledgers and brittle parchment, many untouched for decades. Poirot searched for 2 hours. Finally, he found what he needed: a birth record from 1873. Reuben Elias Bracknell, born to Reginald Bracknell, an unknown mother. Not acknowledged. And beneath it, a notation in different ink. Status: expunged. Poirot sat back, fingers steepled. So there had been a child, a Bracknell by blood, but erased from the family's narrative, a bastard son, a hidden brother to Lord Bracknell himself, a man whose name had been denied, whose burial had been unmarked, whose legacy had been smothered beneath wealth and silence. And now, perhaps, a descendant had returned. Poirot summoned Felix Durand next. They met again in the conservatory, now dark with early evening shadow. Poirot offered him a seat and poured tea, unpoisoned this time. "You have been helpful, Monsieur Durand," Poirot said, "but I must ask now, what drew you to Jeremy Caulfield in the first place?" Durand's smile faltered slightly. "I liked him. He was brilliant. Many are brilliant, but not many draw Parisian rare book dealers to Norfolk estates." Durand said nothing. Poirot pressed. "Did you recognize something in him? A similarity, perhaps?" Durand's eyes narrowed. "He reminded me of someone," he said at last. "Yourself?" "No, my father." Poirot sat back. "Who was your father, Monsieur Durand?" There was silence. Then, "His name was Émile Durand, but that was not his birth name. He was born here, in England." Poirot's voice was a whisper. "He was the son of Reuben Bracknell, wasn't he?" Durand exhaled slowly. "Yes." Poirot's voice did not rise. "Then you are a Bracknell by blood." Durand nodded. "I never wanted to claim it. Not until I met Jeremy. He was the only one who seemed to believe that the past could be rewritten. or reclaimed. Poirot's gaze was piercing. Did Jeremy know? Not at first, but I think, in the end, he guessed. Poirot's fingers tapped the table. And did he approve? Durand looked away. I'm not sure. When Durand left, Poirot stood alone in the dark conservatory, his reflection barely visible in the frosted glass. He stared at it, not with satisfaction, but with the calm that precedes a storm. The connections had emerged, a hidden son, a buried legacy, a descendant returned, and a boy obsessed with silence, now swallowed by it. But one question remained. If Durand was not the villain, then who else had known the truth, and feared what Jeremy might do with it? The answer, Poirot knew, was very close, and growing desperate. Chapter 10. Poirot's Secret Clue. The snow had ceased by morning, but the stillness it left behind was more menacing than the storm. Charnwood Hall stood in suspended silence, as if aware that something within its walls was nearing revelation. The windows reflected grey light without warmth, and the clocks, though wound and reset, ticked uneasily, as if reluctant to measure time for what must come next. In his room, Poirot sat at his desk with a folded scrap of paper before him. It was not part of Jeremy's journal, nor from the old estate ledgers. It was a tiny, near-invisible sliver torn from the lining of the green leather pouch found in the attic box, the same box that had contained the mysterious locket and inventory ledger. The fragment bore only a few words, written in faint ink. You must not open what was sealed by consent. That was all. But to Poirot, it was enough. Someone had gone to great lengths to preserve a secret, but not merely to conceal it. No, this was something older, something ritualistic. The language, sealed by consent, suggested an agreement, a pact, not just a family hiding its shame, but a deliberate silencing of history. And Jeremy, curious, theatrical, and emotionally raw, had broken that silence. Poirot slid the paper into a small envelope and tucked it into his breast pocket. He said nothing to the household about the discovery. Not yet. He needed to observe the ripple first, to see who was still pretending the surface was calm. Downstairs, breakfast was a strained affair. Lady Eugenia presided over a table that no longer obeyed her authority. No one spoke unless directly addressed. The absence of Jeremy, and now the poisoning of Lenora Gray, had hollowed out the usual polite rituals. Even the sound of silverware against china felt intrusive. Poirot studied them all as they sat in their various disguises of civility. Lady Eugenia, whose frost-bitten elegance now looked brittle. Her eyes darted more frequently toward the door. Colonel Willoughby, gruff and rigid, his loyalty increasingly conflicted with his rising suspicion. Isla, pale and restless, unable to sit still, the weight of secrets thick around her. Dr. Cresswell, hiding impatience behind rational calm, but no longer trying to appear detached. Félix Durand, perhaps the calmest of them all now, his confession to Poirot the previous night having released him from the burden of pretense. Lenora Gray, still recovering upstairs, was the only one absent. Poirot sipped his tea, then, very lightly, he said, "Madame, I am curious. Was it you or your late husband who designed the family crest? It appears above the chapel altar and again in the old ledgers. Sunburst enclosed by Ouroboros. A powerful image." Lady Eugenia paused with her spoon halfway to her lips. "It was Reginald's choice," she said carefully. "He fancied himself a traditionalist." "And yet," Poirot continued, setting down his cup, "that symbol is not merely a mark of tradition. It is also used in esoteric circles to denote eternal silence, things agreed never to be spoken, secrets buried in cycle." A silence fell across the table like a dropped curtain. Poirot continued gently, "Forgive me if I overstep, but I find it fascinating that such a crest should adorn a chapel crypt, and yet the name Reuben Bracknell appears nowhere in the official genealogies. Lady Eugenia's voice was sharp. "We agreed that chapter was closed." "Who agreed, madame?" She said nothing. Poirot looked to the others. "You see, even now the language of this house is passive. We agreed it was understood. It was better not to speak of it. But who made the decision? Who held the pen that scratched out a man's life from the book of the living?" It was Cresswell who broke the silence. "Reginald," he said, "and his brother Thomas. They struck Reuben from the record in 1896. The child was illegitimate. There were rumors. Madness, debts, something darker. No one outside the immediate family ever confirmed the story. Lady Eugenia shot him a glare, but he ignored it. Poirot nodded slowly. And yet, someone kept his memory alive. The box in the attic, the locket, the hidden grave. Someone preserved the trace. He looked toward Felix Durand, who said nothing. Poirot then stood and turned his gaze to Isla. "Mademoiselle, you told me Jeremy believed truth had weight, that naming what had been silenced would undo its power. But perhaps he misunderstood. Perhaps naming it gave it life. Perhaps that is why someone tried to stop him." Isla swallowed. "You think someone in this house feared what he would find?" Poirot nodded. "Yes, and I think that fear turned into action." He let the words hang in the air. Then, with a final glance at Lady Eugenia, he said, "I shall now take a stroll to the chapel crypt, alone. There is one more name I must read, not with my eyes, but with my mind." And with that, he left them. In the crypt once more, Poirot stood before the nameless slab. He removed a pencil and paper and traced the faint indentations with a surgeon's precision. As he worked, he murmured softly to himself, "What was sealed by consent?" He completed the rubbing, then folded it carefully. And then, with a frown, he noticed something barely visible in the dust at the stone's edge, a hair, long, pale, and caught in a crack of the stone floor. Poirot plucked it gently and held it to the lantern light. Not Jeremy's. Too fine. He pocketed it. Then, slowly, he turned and exited the crypt. Back in his room, Poirot placed the rubbing and the hair beside his growing collection of clues. He examined them again in silence. He now had what he needed, but he would not announce it. Not yet. Timing was everything. He would let them stew for one more day, let fear grow legs and walk the halls, let guilt begin to mistake silence for accusation. Poirot smiled faintly. The theater was almost ready. The next act would begin with a stumble, someone making the mistake of believing he still didn't know. He did, and the Hatbox, though gone, had already delivered its message. Chapter 11. Tensions rise. By midday, the atmosphere within Charnwood Hall had changed, subtly but unmistakably. Where silence had previously cloaked the household like fresh snow, now it felt brittle, close to fracture. Conversations were no longer whispered, but sharp, urgent. Eyes darted too quickly. Hands stayed near pockets. Breakfast had been left unfinished, and not a single guest remained in the drawing-room longer than necessary. Poirot, having returned from the crypt with deliberate calm, observed everything. Lady Eugenia spent the morning behind closed doors, her maid turning away inquiries with tight lips. Colonel Willoughby, who typically barked commands to servants with military stiffness, now wandered the corridors in quiet agitation, pausing by doors, peering into rooms that were none of his concern. But it was Dr. Cresswell whose behavior drew Poirot's interest most. The doctor had taken to standing in the conservatory, smoking with more frequency than decorum allowed, his posture stiff, as if bracing for some invisible blow. He refused tea, refused lunch. When approached by Isla, he waved her off with a muttered apology and retreated to the east corridor. Poirot followed him. From a distance, naturally. It was there, at the door to the unused solarium, that Cresswell hesitated, looking up and down the hall before withdrawing a small brass key from his pocket. Poirot watched from the shadow of the archway, expression unreadable. Later, after Cresswell had gone, Poirot examined the door himself. It bore no lock. There was no reason for a key, and yet one had been used. By afternoon, the mood had turned uglier. A maid discovered one of the guest-room mirrors had been shattered. Not broken by accident, smashed with force. Poirot inspected the shards himself and noted that none had been stepped on. The break had been ritualistic, a warning perhaps, or an act of desperation. Shortly after, a heated conversation broke out between Lady Eugenia and Colonel Willoughby in the corridor just outside the drawing room. Though Poirot did not hear the beginning, the final words echoed clearly as he passed. "You promised it was over," Lady Eugenia hissed. Willoughby's reply came with bitter contempt. "No, Eugenia, you buried it. The rest of us simply kept our mouths shut." When she turned and saw Poirot approaching, her expression froze into icy dignity. She said nothing and swept past him. Poirot stopped beside Willoughby. "You are beginning to remember what the house has not forgotten," he said. Willoughby gave a grim nod. "Some things should have stayed in the ground." Poirot said nothing more, but his little grey cells stirred. Later that evening, as twilight fell over the frost-covered gardens, Poirot invited the household to gather once again in the library. No announcement of accusation was made, no demand for confessions. He simply requested a brief meeting, and with such gentle insistence that no one could refuse. One by one, they arrived. Lady Eugenia, immaculate but pale. Ella, watchful, the journal still clutched to her side. Cresswell, anxious behind his spectacles. Willoughby, silent and tense. Felix Durand, calm, perhaps too calm. Lenora Gray was absent, still recovering in her chamber. Poirot stood by the fireplace, his back to the mantel. The locket, now cleaned and set into a velvet box, sat on the table before him like a relic. Beside it, the parchment rubbing from the crypt, the journal, and the torn note from the green leather pouch. "I thank you," Poirot began, "for your patience during these last days. You have each answered my questions with varying degrees of honesty, but always with caution. That is understandable. After all, we are not investigating a mere disappearance, nor the mystery of a missing hatbox." He paused. "We are confronting the consequences of silence." The room remained still. "Jeremy Caulfield did not simply stumble upon a family secret," Poirot continued. "He pursued it, he wanted to find it, and he did." He gestured to the journal. "He uncovered the existence of Reuben Elias Bracknell, erased from this family's official lineage, but still present in blood and stone. He found the hidden grave, the missing name, the preserved artifacts." Poirot turned his gaze upon Lady Eugenia. And when he discovered that someone in this house had continued to visit that grave, had lit candles, perhaps whispered apologies, he realized something. The past was not dead. It had simply been muted. Eugenia's hand twitched. Poirot shifted his attention to Durand. "You, monsieur, are a descendant of Reuben. That is known to me now. But you did not send the hatbox." Durand gave a slight nod. "I didn't need to." Poirot turned to the others. "No, it was not he. The sender of the box is someone who wished to punish, but not overtly. Someone who understands theatre, symbolism. Someone who knew that a sealed object carries more weight than an open one. And someone who knew Jeremy would not resist opening it." He looked to Isla. "Tell me, mademoiselle, was Jeremy ever afraid of Lenora?" Her brow furrowed. "No, never. She was the one person he trusted completely." Poirot nodded slowly. "Then we must ask, why was she poisoned? If she was no threat to Jeremy, then why was she silenced?" Cresswell stiffened. Perhaps she knew too much. Or perhaps Poirot said, turning to him with sudden sharpness. She was beginning to guess who truly feared what Jeremy had uncovered. Poirot stepped forward now, voice calm but firm. There is one among us who has not spoken openly, who has answered every question with care, but never with confession, who had access to medicine, to sedatives, and to the habits of every resident in this house. He looked directly at Dr. Cresswell. You, Doctor, had opportunity and motive. The room froze. Cresswell's face contorted into a mask of denial. I've done nothing wrong. Poirot raised a finger, not yet accused, but allow me to ask. What key did you carry to a door that has no lock? Cresswell's mouth opened, then closed. Poirot's voice dropped. You are not protecting the Bracknells, Doctor. You are protecting yourself, because Jeremy had begun to suspect something else, that you are not here solely as a family physician, but as an observer of the inheritance. He let that settle. Cresswell turned abruptly and stormed from the room. Poirot did not stop him. He had what he needed. Now he would wait. A frightened man always reveals more when he believes he has escaped suspicion. And the final piece was nearly in place. Chapter 12. The confrontation. The corridors of Charnwood Hall echoed differently that night. Footsteps seemed to linger, voices carried farther than they should have, and every candle flame trembled as if in anticipation. In the east wing, the lamps burned low. The snow had resumed outside, not in storm but in silence. An insistent hush falling over roof tiles and window ledges like a curtain lowering on the first act of a play. Poirot remained in the drawing room long after the others had left. He sat in the armchair nearest the hearth, hands tented beneath his chin, eyes fixed on the dying fire. He was not waiting for inspiration. He was waiting for movement. And movement, he knew, would come. It always did after pressure. He had applied it, precisely politely, without accusation, but with undeniable weight. The confrontation with Dr. Cresswell had not been an accusation, but a subtle shifting of the ground beneath his feet, just enough to make the man stumble. And now Poirot waited to see where that stumble would lead him. At precisely 10:30, Poirot stood and left the room. He moved without noise, shoes silent against the velvet runner, and turned down the east corridor, the same one where Cresswell had lingered near the solarium door. The key that did not match any known lock in the house. Poirot had since found the lock it did match. But it was not in a door, it was in a cabinet. The solarium was dark, cold, its glass walls filmed with frost. The air smelled faintly of eucalyptus and camphor, familiar scents to anyone who spent long hours in the company of illness. Shelves lined the walls, each filled with labeled jars, tonics, powders, salts, tinctures. But there was one cabinet at the far end, smaller, older, more ornate, that bore no label. Poirot approached it. He withdrew the key from his pocket. It fit perfectly. Inside, nestled among dried herbs and brittle paper packets, were vials, carefully arranged, clearly catalogued, but not part of the house's official medicinal stores. 3 bore names that Poirot recognized: Laudanum, Belladonna, Digitalis. 1 bore no label at all. He took that vial and held it to the light. The liquid inside was pale, nearly clear, with the faintest opalescent shimmer. Not a sedative, something more exotic. He would have it tested, of course. But he already knew what it was meant to do: not to kill, to confuse, to slow, to render the drinker unsure of what they had seen or said, as had happened to Lenora. He returned the vial to the cabinet, relocked it, and turned. Cresswell was standing in the doorway. The lantern in his hand cast wild shadows across his face, accentuating the deep lines beside his mouth, the sheen of sweat along his hairline. "You've been busy," the doctor said, voice tight. Poirot did not flinch. "As have you, Doctor." There was a long pause. The two men stood in silence, separated by a half-lit room and a truth that had now been fully unearthed. Poirot spoke first. "You poisoned her." Cresswell gave a humorless smile. "Not enough to kill, just to stop her from speaking." "Because she knew," Poirot said quietly. "Or suspected. She had been with the family long enough to know the signs of someone watching, recording, waiting." Cresswell stepped forward. "She wasn't supposed to drink it so soon. I meant to confront her, to warn her. I only wanted to delay the damage she could do." Poirot raised a brow. "Damage to whom, Doctor? To you, or to the Bracknell name?" Cresswell exhaled, shoulders sagging slightly. "To both. But I didn't hurt Jeremy. I swear that." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Then who did?" Cresswell didn't answer. Poirot stepped closer. "You were placed here by Lord Reginald, weren't you? Not just as physician, but as caretaker of his secrets. You were the keeper of the family's silences." Cresswell nodded once, bitterly. He needed someone to manage what couldn't be buried in ledgers. I was that someone. Even after his death. Especially after. Poirot's voice was low, and when Jeremy began digging, Cresswell's jaw tightened. He was clever, too clever. He put the pieces together faster than I'd feared. I tried to dissuade him. I warned him, subtly, then more directly. I told Lady Eugenia. I begged her to intervene." Poirot tilted his head. "She refused?" "She didn't want to believe. Or she did believe, and feared what it meant." Poirot studied him. "You didn't send the Hatbox?" "No." "Then who did?" Cresswell looked up, eyes shining with something near anguish. "I think—" "He did." "Jeremy?" Cresswell nodded slowly. "I think he found something, made something, left it here. A message not for us, but for the Bracknell name, for the past." Poirot was silent for a long moment. Then, "And where is he now?" Cresswell's voice broke. "I don't know." Poirot turned from him, walking back through the solarium without another word. Cresswell did not follow, but the silence between them had spoken volumes. When Poirot returned to the main corridor, Isla was waiting outside his door. She looked pale, her eyes bloodshot. She held something in her hand, a page torn from Jeremy's journal. "I found this behind the curtain in his room," she said. "He must have hidden it." Poirot took it gently. The handwriting was rough, frantic. The ink smudged. "If they silence me, it means I was right, but if I vanish, don't look above. Look beneath." Poirot folded the page, slid it into his coat, and took Isla gently by the arm. "Come," he said. "It is time we return to the beginning." She frowned. "The beginning?" "Yes, mademoiselle. To the study, to the fire, and to the place where the Hatbox stood." Together they walked down the corridor, past the shadows and the portraits, toward the door where silence had first cracked. Poirot now had every thread he needed. All that remained was to tie them and reveal who had been pulling them. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape. The study had not changed. The books still lay scattered where Jeremy had once strewn them. The poker leaned against the hearth. The faint outline of the vanished Hatbox still darkened the desk's polished surface like the ghost of a shadow. But Poirot, as he stepped inside with Isla at his side, noticed one thing that had changed. The dust. There was a fine film along the edge of the baseboard beneath the desk, disrupted only recently, just enough to suggest movement. Something or someone had returned here within the last 12 hours. He knelt, inspecting it more closely. His fingers brushed the floor. A groove. Deliberate. Narrow. Not from a box. From a latch. Isla watched him from the doorway, hands clenched. "What is it?" Poirot didn't answer. Instead, he moved the desk aside just enough to reach the edge of the hearthstone nearest the wall. With a quiet grunt, he pressed on the groove. There was a click, soft but definite. The hearth shifted. Just a centimetre, but enough. A hidden panel, Poirot murmured. Très intéressant. He stood. Jeremy's journal mentioned not to look above, but beneath. I assumed metaphor, but it is literal. Isla stepped forward, heart in her throat. You think he's down there? I think, Poirot said, someone believed he would be found down there. Together they lifted the hearthstone, revealing a narrow trap-door beneath, expertly carved to blend with the stone floor. It led to a short set of wooden steps descending into darkness. Poirot lit a lamp. Wait here, but Isla was already moving beside him. No. He gave her a brief look, then nodded once. They descended. The space below was not a cellar in the traditional sense. It was a servant's crawl space, forgotten with time, sealed after renovations, likely unnoticed for decades. The walls were brick, the air dry and still. Cobwebs hung like curtains in the corners, and there, slumped against the far wall, was Jeremy's coat. Isla gasped, rushing forward, but Poirot stopped her with a hand to her arm. No. He advanced first. The coat had been laid deliberately, not discarded. Beneath it was a folded blanket. A candle stub, burnt to its base. A pencil and notebook, half filled. He picked it up. The first page was dated 4 days ago. If you find this, it means I didn't make it out in time. But it wasn't murder. I chose this. I needed to prove what had been erased. I needed them to know. Poirot exhaled slowly. He was here, alive, hiding. Isla trembled. Hiding from whom? Before Poirot could answer, there was a sound above. A footfall, heavy, running. Poirot turned. Go, mademoiselle. Go quickly. That was not a servant. She obeyed at once, scrambling up the steps. Poirot followed seconds later, but by the time they emerged into the study, the door was ajar and the corridor beyond empty. Someone was watching us, Isla breathed. They knew we found it. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Someone who needed to erase the last trace, and failed. He moved swiftly, calling out to Hargrove in the hallway. The butler appeared moments later. I need the outer doors watched. No one leaves, no guests, no staff. Hargrove bowed. Understood. Poirot then turned to Isla. Gather everyone in the drawing room. Tell them the truth is known. Say nothing more. She nodded, her expression pale but resolute, and vanished down the corridor. Poirot turned and walked to the grand staircase, where he knew the east corridor met the upper floor. There was only one person in this house who had reason to panic now. Not earlier, not when the Hatbox first vanished, not when Jeremy disappeared, but now, when the hiding place had been found, and that person was Lady Eugenia. He found her standing in her dressing room, still in morning black, gazing into a tall mirror, her expression unreadable. You found it, she said, without turning. Yes, madame. And he's gone? Poirot stepped inside, closing the door quietly. He left the house 2 days ago, through the old wine hatch in the western wall. My men found footprints, deliberately disguised under fresh snow, but the stride was clear. He had help. Lady Eugenia closed her eyes. So he lives. Poirot said nothing. She turned. Her face looked older in the firelight, less proud, more tired. The porcelain mask had cracks now. I tried to stop him, you know, not by violence, by reason. I told him what truth does, what it costs. Poirot met her gaze. And when that failed? I panicked, she said. I didn't send the Hatbox, but I let it stay. I told Hargrove not to remove it, and when it disappeared, I said nothing. And when Jeremy vanished, I prayed it would resolve itself, that the house would do what it had always done, absorb the scandal and forget. But someone else acted, Poirot said softly. Cresswell. She hesitated. Yes, he dosed the tea. He silenced Lenora. And I let him. Poirot stepped closer. Why? She looked him in the eye. Because my father-in-law made a pact with shame, and I inherited it. I lived inside a lie so long, I forgot what light looked like. But Jeremy remembered. Poirot nodded slowly. And now the light has returned. Lady Eugenia didn't answer. She turned back to the mirror. Poirot watched her a moment longer, then turned and left the room without another word. Downstairs, the drawing room was full. Willoughby, Isla, Cresswell, Durand. Even Lenora, pale but upright, had been helped in on Dr. Cresswell's arm. They turned as Poirot entered. He took his place by the fire once more, and said simply, "Mesdames et messieurs, the time has come." The truth was no longer hidden, but it had not yet been spoken. That moment would be next, and none would leave unchanged. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place. The drawing room of Charnwood Hall had never been so quiet, not even in grief. The fire crackled in the hearth, its heat chased by cold draughts sneaking beneath the heavy velvet curtains. Outside, the snow no longer fell. It waited, suspended in the stillness like the truth that now sat heavily upon every chest in the room. Hercule Poirot stood before the assembled guests, his back to the fire. His silhouette, trim and composed, cast a long shadow across the parquet floor. The room before him was full, but no one dared speak. Lady Eugenia, seated upright and pale, her composure clinging to her like a final corset. Colonel Willoughby, arms folded, jaw clenched. Uilla, trembling slightly, though her eyes burned with purpose. Dr. Cresswell, visibly drained, his collar slightly wilted. Felix Durand, who sat stillest of all, and Lenora Gray, returned from her bed, her hands laced on her lap, her stare distant. Poirot did not begin with accusation. He began with the house. "Charnwood Hall," he said softly, "is more than an estate. It is a keeper of records, not in ledgers, not in portraits, not in vaults, but in silence, in omissions, in names removed, graves concealed, and histories rewritten." He paced slowly. "You have all in your way protected something, a legacy, a shame, a myth. And into this silence came a boy with too many questions and not enough fear. Jeremy Caulfield. He believed that truth could heal what had been hidden. He believed that the past, once uncovered, would make the present whole." Poirot turned, pausing at the hearth. "But truth is not balm. Truth is fire, and someone here tried to smother it." He let the words hang. "Let us now speak of what happened." He gestured to Isla. Jeremy uncovered the name Reuben Bracknell, long forgotten, struck from the family records. He found his grave, his locket, his ledger. He discovered a hidden sibling of Lord Reginald, a brother whose descendants were denied name and inheritance. Poirot turned now to Durand. "Monsieur Durand is that descendant, but he is not our villain. He made no threat. He came only to witness what Jeremy was unearthing." Durand inclined his head once. Poirot continued. "The hatbox was not sent by Durand, nor by any outsider. Jeremy placed it himself. It was a performance, a provocation. The box was an object of fear, an unanswered riddle. He used it to stir the house, to see who would tremble." He turned to face them all now. And someone did tremble. Poirot moved toward the table where he had placed the green journal, the locket, and the vial from the solarium. After the hatbox vanished, Jeremy did not. He hid, in the old crawlspace beneath the hearth. Why? Because he wanted to observe the reaction. He wanted to know who would reveal themselves once they believed he was gone. Poirot looked to Cresswell. "And you, Doctor, moved first." Cresswell swallowed but said nothing. "You drugged Miss Gray with a compound not registered in the estate records. I found it in a locked cabinet in the solarium along with other illicit tinctures. You feared she knew too much. Cresswell spoke then, low and rough. "I was trying to protect the family." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "No, Doctor, you were trying to protect yourself. You were not only the Bracknells' physician, you were their archivist. You knew of Reuben, of his burial. You maintained the silence Reginald demanded, and were paid for your discretion." A shocked murmur passed through the room. Poirot continued, "But it was not you who made Jeremy disappear." Now he turned to the last person yet to speak. Lady Eugenia. She did not flinch. "You knew what he had found. You confronted him in this very room the night he vanished. But you did not harm him. You let him go to the crawl space. You locked the door behind him. You believed he would emerge when the others had calmed." She spoke at last, her voice quiet but clear. "I believed he would wait. I was wrong." Poirot nodded. "And when he didn't emerge, you panicked. You told no one. You prayed it would resolve itself." A long silence. Poirot turned now to the final mystery. The one that still ticked in the back of his mind like the missing clocks. The Hatbox. We assumed it vanished, but it did not. Jeremy took it with him into the crawl space, and when he fled the estate, 2 days ago, through the old wine hatch, he left it behind. He lifted a cloth from the corner of the room. Beneath it stood the box. Recovered that morning, now open, empty. Poirot said, "It never contained anything at all." There was a stir of disbelief. Poirot smiled faintly. "That is its genius. An empty box carries more power than a full one, when everyone believes it is dangerous." He gestured to the group. This was Jeremy's final message, that fear is not what is inside the box. Fear is what is buried beneath the floorboards of family legacy, and silence, when held too long, becomes rot. He let the silence settle, then stepped back from the fire. "You each played your part in this charade, some with cruelty, some with cowardice, but Jeremy Caulfield is alive. He proved his point." He looked to Isola. "And now, mademoiselle, it is your turn to choose. Will you inherit the silence, or break it for good?" Her lips parted. Her eyes shone with sudden, terrifying clarity. "I won't be quiet," she said. "Not anymore." Poirot bowed his head. "Then justice has been served." Not by courts, but by light, and in the silence that followed, the last piece of the puzzle quietly fell into place. Chapter 15. The final gathering. Morning broke not with light, but with clarity. The storm had passed, and the snow no longer fell. It simply lay, undisturbed and dense, like silence fossilized into form. The grounds of Charnwood Hall looked pristine again, but everyone within knew better. The house had changed, not in architecture or structure, but in air. Something had shifted beneath the ornate ceilings and ancestral walls. And now, the final act was to begin. Poirot requested the presence of all remaining guests and family in the long dining hall. No longer for a meal, but for a reckoning. At precisely 10 o'clock they gathered. The table had not been set. No silver, no wine. Only 12 empty chairs, and Poirot standing at the head, a small black notebook closed neatly before him. The room's cold grandeur seemed almost theatrical now, the chandeliers above, the portrait of Lord Reginald glowering from the far wall, and beneath it all, the gathered suspects, each wearing silence as armor. Poirot waited until every seat was filled. Then, softly, "You have each played your role in this most troubling affair, and now I will walk you through the precise sequence of what has happened." He opened his notebook with quiet precision. "Let us begin not with the vanishing of Jeremy Caulfield, but with a death that occurred long ago and was erased from memory. Reuben Elias Bracknell, born in 1873, the unacknowledged son of Reginald's father." He turned to Lady Eugenia. "You knew. You did not cause it, but you consented to its silence. The attic box, the locket, the ledger, all proof that he had existed, were left hidden until now. Poirot moved down the line of seated guests. Jeremy discovered this, piece by piece, but he was no common scholar. He was theatrical, dramatic. So he chose to stage his discovery, not with words, but with ritual. Poirot raised one hand, mimicking the gesture of lifting a lid. The hatbox, empty, delivered anonymously, sealed in wax. It was not a threat. It was an invitation to confession. Jeremy wanted to see who would react, who would panic, and someone did. He turned to Dr. Cresswell. You, doctor, had the most to lose. You had been entrusted with the darker chapters of this family's history, paid to keep them still, and when you realized Jeremy had gone too far, you acted, not with violence, but with interruption. You dosed Lenora Gray's tea, not to harm, but to delay her, to throw the house into confusion. Cresswell stared down at the table, jaw tight, lips thin. Poirot continued, You were not the only one to act. Lady Eugenia, knowing where Jeremy had gone, to the crawl space beneath the study, chose to let him remain hidden. You told no one. You believed he would return, as he always had. He looked to her now, but when he did not, you hoped the matter would resolve itself, that the house would swallow it all again. She did not deny it. Poirot paced slowly, but Jeremy was not merely hiding. He was recording. He left behind a journal, letters, even an escape route. 2 nights ago, he left the house through the old wine hatch behind the cellar wall. We found the trail, his footprints hidden beneath a raked pattern of branches. Poirot turned to Isla, and he left the final message to you. Isla nodded silently, holding the torn page from Jeremy's journal. Poirot lifted a hand, but there remained one question, one final inconsistency. The mirror, shattered in the guest wing, a small act, but out of place. I pondered it all night. Then I understood. He pointed toward Lenora Gray. It was you. Gasps echoed. Even Lady Eugenia turned sharply. Lenora blinked slowly. You're mistaken. Poirot shook his head. You've said very little during this investigation, but that has been your method all along. Silence was your disguise. You were once Jeremy's tutor, his confidant, but you were also Reuben Bracknell's granddaughter. Lenora flinched, but didn't deny it. You were the true keeper of the locket, Poirot said. Not Eugenia, not Jeremy. You placed it in the attic box. You ensured he would find it. You lit the candles at the unmarked grave. Poirot stepped closer, and you watched silently as Jeremy pursued your shared truth. But when he vanished and the house began to crumble, you panicked. You smashed the mirror to see if someone would notice, a cry for help disguised as damage. Lenora's voice at last came low and steady. I had to know if anyone still cared, if his blood still meant anything. Poirot softened. And you believed, for a time, that Jeremy was dead, that the truth had cost you both everything. She closed her eyes. But he lives? Poirot nodded. Yes, mademoiselle. He lives, and your legacy, though once erased, is now restored. Lenora did not cry, but her hands trembled in her lap, unclasping at last. Poirot turned once more to the group. The family has not been cursed. It has been wounded by its own refusal to heal, but healing is now possible because the silence has ended. He closed the notebook. The hatbox was never meant to destroy. It was meant to open, and now that it has, so must you. He gave one final bow. The mystery, mesdames et messieurs, is solved. He stepped back as the room exhaled, some in tears, some in silence, but all transformed. And somewhere beyond the snow-framed windows, Jeremy Caulfield walked beneath a grey sky toward something new, and behind him, at last, the house had spoken. Chapter 16. The Reveal. The snow outside Charnwood Hall had begun to melt in slow, uneven ribbons, running down the ivy-clad stones like ink from an old confession. Indoors, the fire in the drawing-room had been relit, casting long golden lines across the floor where once the Hatbox had sat, closed, ominous, and wordless. But now everything had a voice. The guests sat in a quiet stillness, none daring to leave, each of them suspended between relief and reckoning. The secrets had surfaced, but one final answer still lay unopened, one knot yet to be untied. Hercule Poirot stood once again, not with ceremony this time, but with the quiet assurance of a man who had seen the last domino fall. He moved to the center of the room. "You are owed not only the truth, mes amis," he said, "but the sequence of the truth. The precise mechanics, so that there may be no doubt, no ambiguity, only clarity." All eyes turned toward him. Even Lady Eugenia, her posture no longer rigid but resigned, leaned slightly forward in her chair. Poirot began. "Let us start with the Hatbox, the symbol that began this chain. Jeremy Caulfield had found the secret of Reuben Elias Bracknell, but rather than expose it directly, he chose a different path. A test. He placed the box in full view, without label, delivered in mystery. He sealed it not to protect, but to provoke. And it worked. He turned toward Dr. Cresswell. "You reacted first, because you had been complicit in maintaining the Bracknell silence for decades. You saw the box not as a curiosity, but as a threat. You warned Eugenia. You searched Jeremy's belongings. You even, as we now know, prepared your own medicine cabinet for contingencies." Cresswell did not deny it. He simply closed his eyes. Poirot continued. "Then Jeremy disappeared, or so it seemed. In truth, he went into hiding beneath the hearthstone, into the forgotten crawl space under the study. He left behind a false scene of disorder, a trail of confusion, he observed from the shadows. Waiting." Poirot now turned to Lady Eugenia. "You knew where he had gone. You saw him enter. You let him stay, not from malice, but fear. You hoped the storm would pass, that the house would swallow it as it always had." Lady Eugenia spoke at last, her voice like fine crystal under strain. "I thought if I waited, he'd come back to me, changed, calmer, ready to let it go." Poirot nodded. But Jeremy never intended to let go, nor should he have. He now gestured to Isla, then to Lenora Gray. It was the women of this house who bore the weight of the silence longest. Lenora, the hidden descendant. Isla, the witness, the loyal heart. You were not villains. You were carriers of history, of grief. Lenora said nothing, but Isla bowed her head, tears rising in her eyes. Poirot moved next to Félix Durand. "And you, Monsieur Durand? You arrived under shadow, but your presence brought no harm. You did not send the box. You did not threaten the family. You only watched. And what you saw confirmed the stories your father once told." Durand gave a quiet nod. "I never needed vengeance, only validation." Poirot looked to Colonel Willoughby now. "You, Colonel, were perhaps the least involved, yet you saw more than you admitted. You knew of the erased name. You knew something had been hidden." Willoughby grunted. "I served beside Reginald. I watched him build a life on omissions. I didn't condone it, but I wasn't brave enough to stop it." Poirot gave a slow nod. "And that is the quiet accomplice to all silences. Fear." Then Poirot returned to the hearth. He lifted a folded page from his notebook. "Jeremy left us one final message, in the crawl space, alongside his coat and journal. He wrote this the night before he fled. I have his permission to read it aloud." He opened the page and began. "To those still upstairs, if I vanish, it is not because I ran from this house, but because I refused to let it erase me. You were content with silence. I was not. I am a Bracknell, by name or not, and so is Lenora. So is Felix. So are the forgotten. We do not need inheritance to exist. We only need recognition. You sealed a truth long ago in wax and shame. I am breaking that seal. I will not return until the house is ready. Until it can say my name aloud. The room was silent. Then, softly, Iella whispered, "Jeremy." And for the first time since his disappearance, his name was spoken aloud in full. Poirot closed the note gently. "This was never about murder," he said. "It was about memory, about the crime of erasure, about truth that survived despite every effort to bury it." He turned once more to Lady Eugenia. "And now, Madame, it falls to you. Will you honor this message? Or bury it once again?" Eugenia looked at the fire, then at the window, then, finally, at Lenora. Her voice was dry but clear. "I will amend the records. Reuben will be acknowledged. His descendants, too." Poirot did not smile. He simply gave a soft nod. "It is enough." He turned and walked to the sideboard, where his gloves and hat had been laid neatly on a tray. "Mes amis," he said as he picked them up, "my role here is complete." Lady Eugenia rose. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, voice almost trembling, "I cannot undo the past, but you have forced it to speak. That is no small thing." Poirot bowed slightly. "The past always wishes to speak, Madame. It only waits for someone to listen." And with that, he stepped into the hall, leaving behind the drawing room, the house, and the silence that had finally broken. Behind him, Isla picked up the locket and held it tight. This time, there would be no forgetting. Chapter 17. Outcome and Justice. The train from Norfolk to London rolled through a quiet, snow-fringed countryside as Hercule Poirot sat alone in a first-class compartment, his gloved hands folded neatly atop his lap, his gaze fixed not on the passing landscape but on the faint reflection in the window, his own expression inscrutable as ever. The mystery had been solved, yes, but as with all cases rooted in family, legacy, and silence, justice was not a matter of punishment alone. It was a matter of reckoning. Charnwood Hall had not been a crime scene. It had been a palimpsest, layer upon layer of denial, of carefully erased names and sealed documents, of traditions built atop abandonment. Jeremy Caulfield had cracked the final layer, not with force, but with provocation, with a performance, and Poirot had simply been the man in the audience who understood the script before the final act. But justice still had its forms, its consequences. And as the train rumbled southward, Poirot reflected on each player's fate. 3 days earlier, on the morning after the final gathering, Lady Eugenia had stood before the estate solicitor and made the declaration herself. Let the name of Reuben Elias Bracknell be restored. Let his bloodline be recognized, and the shame that erased him be noted in full, in the hand of a Bracknell. She signed the document with an unsteady hand. When she handed it back, she said only, "It's time the ghosts knew we could speak their names." From that moment forward, Felix Durand, Lenora Gray, and through them Jeremy Caulfield, would no longer be the whispers outside the gates. They would be part of the Bracknell record, however complicated. Dr. Cresswell had submitted a quiet resignation that same day. Poirot met with him alone in the solarium, the same place where the cabinet of illicit vials still sat, now emptied by the authorities, catalogued and sealed in evidence bags. "You will not be charged with attempted murder," Poirot told him, "but you will be discredited." Cresswell had not argued. "It was never meant to harm," he said again, "only to delay the unraveling." Poirot had replied, "You were paid to preserve a wound rather than to treat it. That is the crime, Doctor. Not chemical, but moral." He left Norfolk the next morning, his license already under review. Lenora Gray did not leave Charnwood Hall. But she left her role. No longer the silent companion, the governess with unknown roots, she emerged as something else entirely, not claimant, Not accuser, simply a descendant. A woman with a name, and now with history. The locket Jeremy had uncovered, the one she had first hidden in the attic, was now hers again. She wore it around her neck, tucked beneath the collar of her dark wool coat, close to the heart that had been denied lineage. When Poirot spoke with her for the final time, just before departing, he asked if she intended to remain at the estate. She had replied, "Not forever, but long enough to know it's safe to leave." He understood. Colonel Willoughby returned to his cottage on the edge of the estate, not with disgrace, but with an old soldier's melancholy, the kind that comes not from defeat, but from finally seeing the battlefield clearly. He sent a letter to Poirot a week later. It read, "You were right. I stood by too long. But I've begun to write, my own record of what I saw, what I stayed silent about. Perhaps someday it will matter. Perhaps only to me." Poirot kept the letter, unfolded, unanswered, but remembered. As for Isla, she was the first to receive word of Jeremy's return. It came in the form of a small, heavy envelope addressed in his hand. Inside, a photograph, a windswept coastline, Cornwall perhaps, beneath a grey sky, and on the back in his tidy scrawl, "It's quieter here." But not the old kind of quiet. "I think I'm ready to build something new. If you're still listening, thank you." She carried the photo with her as she walked the halls of Charnwood in the following weeks. The silence was different now. No longer accusatory, no longer watchful, simply space. Room, perhaps, for a new story. Back on the train, Poirot pulled from his coat pocket a copy of the local newspaper, folded crisply, uncreased at the corners. He read the headline again. "Bracknell Lineage, Rewritten, a Legacy of Silence Ends." Below, a small article detailed the family's formal acknowledgement of Reuben Elias Bracknell, citing pressure from uncovered historical documents and internal family re-evaluation. Poirot closed the paper and set it aside. There would be no trial, no dramatic fall from grace, but justice had come, in the form it often takes in such matters, truth made public. And Poirot, master of puzzles and logic, found himself quietly satisfied. There were no perfect endings, only honest ones. He arrived at King's Cross just after sunset. London welcomed him with its usual fog and gaslight and brisk chatter. He stepped from the train, coat buttoned, hat tilted neatly, moustache undisturbed. But as he moved toward the station doors, he paused. A figure stood by the edge of the platform, young, tall, wrapped in a long coat. A man Poirot recognized instantly, even before the face turned. Jeremy. The young man gave a brief, solemn nod, then stepped into the crowd and was gone. Poirot smiled. He said nothing, but to himself he thought, "The boy has left the theatre. He is now the playwright." And with that, Hercule Poirot stepped into the London fog. The case was closed, but the story, at last, had begun. Chapter 18. The closing remark. A month had passed. The snow had melted from the hedgerows and garden walls of Norfolk, leaving in its place soft earth and rivulets of water carving their way through old moss and stone. Charnwood Hall stood as it always had, grim, elegant, unmoved. But inside, something subtle had changed. The silence that once pressed against the walls no longer felt like weight, but like air. There was room now, for sound, for history, for memory. Lady Eugenia had taken to walking the south garden paths in the early mornings, her cane tapping against frost-thinned gravel. Isla oversaw the repair of the estate's record room, where a full genealogy, Reuben's name included, now hung, unframed but present, beneath the stained-glass window. No one commented on it anymore. It simply was. Lenora had begun writing letters to Jeremy. not because she expected a reply, but because she finally believed she could. And Poirot? He had returned to his London flat on Whitehaven Mansions, content with his orchids, his Egyptian cigarettes, and his silence, though his was of a different kind, one that had earned its stillness. It was a quiet March morning when Captain Hastings arrived unannounced, raincoat damp, face curious as always. "You've been rather elusive, Poirot," Hastings said, removing his gloves. "I read the newspaper pieces about the Bracknell estate. Bit dramatic, all that." Poirot smiled faintly. "Ah, mon ami, only to those who do not understand the weight of an unspoken name." Hastings sat down. "You do rather enjoy a theatrical case." "But this," Poirot said, "was not theatre. This was healing performed in mystery's clothing." Hastings leaned forward. "But tell me one thing, old chap. Why didn't you confront Jeremy when he returned to the station?" Poirot's eyes twinkled. "Because, mon cher Hastings, he did not return to confess. He returned to see if the house could carry on without him. And it could. That is the victory. You think he'll go back?" "No," Poirot said quietly. "He has already moved forward." There was a pause. Then Hastings chuckled. "Still, you must admit, an empty hatbox? All that fuss?" Poirot's mustache twitched. "Ah, but you miss the point entirely. An empty hatbox is the perfect trap. Not because of what it contains, but because of what everyone fears it might." He leaned back in his chair. "And fear, Hastings, reveals character better than confession ever could." Hastings nodded slowly. "So, who was the guilty party?" Poirot's smile faded to something more thoughtful. "They all were," he said, "and none of them." Hastings blinked. "That sounds like cheating." "It is human nature," Poirot said. "No villain with a dagger this time, only a family wounded by history, and a boy who chose to make the wound visible." He stood now, walking to the window. Outside, the street bustled with the familiar energy of London. But Poirot's gaze was far away. He turned back with the faintest smile. "In the end, Hastings, I solved no murder, but I did help a truth be born." Hastings stood as well, reaching for his coat. "And what now?" Poirot adjusted his cuffs. "Now," he said, "we rest the little grey cells, until the next shadow knocks." And with that, Hercule Poirot turned back to his orchids, his calm restored, and the mystery of the hatbox, like all great mysteries, folded quietly into the vault of memory. Case closed. And somewhere, far from Charnwood's walls, Jeremy Caulfield walked freely, his name intact, his story his own, no longer silenced. The truth, once buried in dust and denial, now lived in ink, in memory, and in the hearts of the unforgotten.